Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. For those who don't know, class, we are the Centre for Labour and Social Studies, a left think tank originating in the trade union movement. So we have a authentic connection to working people, but we combine the sort of grassroots voices with intellectually compelling analysis. We've been championing left policy debates since our creation, and we cover issues from employment, financial system, the macroeconomy, public services. But we also recognise that all of these things are intrinsically linked to inequalities in income, wealth, race, class, and gender. And for a fairer society, we need to really restructure the economy. In terms of this report, I think our key strengths in class is, like I said, these links to the trade unions, which has meant we're able to pull together the views of reps, trade union reps from across the economy. Which has been amazing. So in one sense, I think a lot of what's in this report you will understand already, but I hope that it adds a lot of detail and enriches the story that we're trying to tell in a way that is helpful to our movement. So there's basically 3 sections to the report, which hopefully a link will be sent around after, and people can read in full if they want. The first analyses ONS labour market figures. And just shows us again what we sort of know, that the economic impact of the pandemic was huge, but also just incredibly uneven. The second section goes on to show how these variations are not random, that the pressures created by the pandemic served mostly to expose and worsen existing inequalities, creating like real hardship for some people, but not all. But also that these failings in the economy have lessened our ability to deal with the health crisis itself, then creating a kind of vicious cycle between a broken economy and a healthcare system that was just struggling to manage. But the report ends on a more hopeful note, showing that throughout the pandemic, it did cause a kind of new wave of collectivism. It bolstered engagement through unions and lots of workers, and broadened sort of established power, but then also reached new workers that maybe had not been so engaged before. So I'm going to go through those sections now in a bit more detail. So the first point to make, I think, regarding the impact on employment was just that it was really huge. The furlough scheme was a huge win for the union movement, and I think we should hold on to it as it proves the viability and popularity of significant and quick state intervention. But one effect of it has definitely been to mask the true scale of the employment crisis. Whilst unemployment rose to around 5% at the worst point in the pandemic, the number of people out of work was around 17% of population if you included those that were on furlough. You can see this chart is the sort of yellow bit towards the bottom is unemployment, and the purple block against time is people who are on furlough. So 17% across the population, but that was 38% for those under 25 and as high as 60% of under 18s not working. And this is still relevant to us now. There's 3 million people now that are currently not working, which is close. It was approaching 10% of the working population. And I think my concern particularly is that, as we saw after the financial crash, that unemployment will resolve to kind of underemployment, to low wages, to more and more people being forced into insecure forms of work. So it's very much, I think, this, the economic impact isn't far from over. To give you a sense of geographical and historical context, the scale of this impact, you can see on the left, comparing to different nations, the increase in unemployment, that is, in the UK is bigger than the OECD average and the EU average. And alongside that, the decrease in vacancies was bigger than any other reporting country. And on the right-hand side, it compare it to the impact of the financial crash. And across numerous metrics, the initial impact is definitely far worse. And whilst there's some truth to the idea that was being peddled of a V-shaped recovery, that V is asymmetric. We've not come back to the point that we started from. And then I guess the next major point from that quantitative analysis is that these impacts varied hugely across the economy. So on the left-hand side, you can see like per sector. And so this is in May 2020, only 4% of the hospitality sector was still working, while over 98% of civil service jobs continued, and a whole range of variation in between those two extremes. And unfortunately, in most cases where there was a high level of furlough, it did ultimately led to redundancies. We also know that the virus itself had a disproportionate effect on different ethnicities. So on the far right-hand side, you can see the mortality rates for different, that is showing different jobs. We know that, so Black African men were 3.8 more times likely to die than white men. And this directly relates to employment, we think, in no small part. You can see down the side the different jobs and the mortality rates. And 3 of the most dangerous occupations in terms of COVID were security guard, care worker, and taxi drivers. And all of those have significantly less white people in the sector than the general population. So there is a relationship between work and the sort of health disparities there. But that racial disparity also played out in the economy. You can see that the white population saw a 23% increase in unemployment over the period of 2020. But in Indian and Chinese communities, that was over 90%. I mentioned earlier the impact on younger workers. In December last year, white under 25-year-olds had over 12% unemployment compared to 4.5 for white over 25s. But if you look intersectionally at race and age, you can see that Black under 25s, this soared to 42% unemployment, meaning that a Black 24-year-old is over 9 times less likely to find work than a white adult. So yeah, they're not insignificant differences. This is, in some cases, it's an order of magnitude between how people have been affected. And then the next part of the report just tries to show that there is a pattern to these disparities. It's not random. It is invariably lowest paid industries were more likely to put on furlough and then more likely to see redundancies. And so that's all of that information I've shared so far is essentially coming from the government data. But as part of the report, we also conducted our own survey of 2,000 workers. And from that, we got extra information, and we can see that this change in whether you're being on furlough or made redundant directly impacted people's lives. We see that lowest paid industries were far more likely to eat out of their savings during the pandemic, while higher paid industries were actually quite likely to increase their savings. And yeah, I think a story that came out to me is that there is a reason why particular industries suffered more than others, and it is because those industries are staffed by younger people, a higher portion of people with so-called low-skilled jobs that are just less able to fight themselves and protect themselves, basically. Something that I would definitely recommend looking at in the report, one way to sort of look at that fact in more detail was that we pulled out 2 examples, a kind of typical hospitality worker and a typical finance worker, and talked through the pandemic from their perspective. And you can see that, yeah, hospitality workers starting on minimum wage, finance industry has an average wage of over 60 grand. And that's, yeah, from that starting point, there's just a catalogue of changes, and at each point, the hospitality workers, you just get their issues piled upon issues, essentially. We then go into that to show that the various ways that this mechanism played out. We then take a few different starting conditions of work. So we look at minimum wage, 0 hours contracts, atypical working arrangements. And we see that time after time, the process that occurred is that by trying to maintain the current system rather than fixing the underlying problems, the government's pandemic response just stacked new variations of problems on top of workers' existing issues. And this came out again from speaking to this full range of trade unions, reps from across the economy. It was remarkable, the consistency in which people told me that the pandemic had exposed or accelerated or put on steroids the problems that they already knew. This ranged from the fairly obvious sort of underfunding and, as a result, understaffing of public services. We saw how workers that are on a minimum wage were put on furlough and now moved to 80% of minimum wage, which is, someone pointed out, not enough, because otherwise 80% minimum wage would be 80% of what it is. Workers on 0 hour contracts who are already left to the whims of their employers now found that even the furlough came down to their discretion, whether they were placed on furlough, what number of hours and working pattern that furlough was based on. Saw how atypical workers in the arts sectors, who are used to and other sectors, but I think art sector is a good example of it, who are used to sort of negotiating gaps in employment law, they suddenly found themselves falling through the cracks of this support system. But the same process of, these existing problems being magnified, extended to globalized supply, just-in-time supply chains, meaning that manufacturing lines were often shut down, not necessarily because of a lack of demand, but because components couldn't cross borders quickly enough. We saw how at the moment we really need to be greening our economy, the government's lack of industrial strategy meant that the reduction in demand for travel quickly translated to some crippling progress in building of electric buses and electric car manufacturing plants. And even to the extent that queues at borders meant that government relaxed labour laws, leaving lorry drivers working longer hours with shorter breaks. This happened twice during the pandemic. So just time and time again, the health crisis, it didn't create problems, it just magnified the existing problems within the economy. But a second thread that came out of all of these interviews was that the failings that existed in the economy also had the effect of worsening the health crisis itself. So I think the problems in the under-resourced NHS are quite well known, but the privatised care sector was given even less support, had less PPE, and was, because of the marketisation of it, was fractured so that there wasn't even kind of consistent guidance issued in that sector like there was in the NHS. But then I think more maybe indirectly, just having a population that has had a decade living in precarity, coupled with the second lowest sick pay in Europe, just had massive knock-on effects. So again, from our survey data, we saw that only half of the people that we surveyed were financially secure enough to isolate when the guidance said they should. And the result of that was that only 17% of people with symptoms actually came forward for a test. And that even 15% of those that tested positive felt the need to go to work anyway. And in my view, this is made worse by understaffing and the sort of slow stripping back of workers' rights. We saw that 25% of the workers we asked said they had been pressured to go into work when they felt that they shouldn't have. And in some cases, one of the worst stories we heard was of DVLA staff being told to turn off their test and trace apps, and Border Patrol people working at Heathrow and Border Patrol being asked not to wear masks because it gave the wrong impression to visitors. You see, interestingly, DVLA are now on strike. They had one of the worst outbreaks, well, I think the worst outbreak in any workplace, and are still today on strike, trying to fight for just to have their workplace made safe with proper social distancing. But as I said, finally, the report does end on somewhat of a positive note. You can see on this graph that I was looking at redundancies versus union density, and we can show that where people do have high levels of density in sectors, it clearly offered them some real protection. And yeah, this was echoed in lots of interviews where, again, over and over was told that where workplaces were properly organised, they were far more likely to receive furlough and, importantly, far more likely to have a safe workplace. Supported by our survey data as well, with trade union members being a lot more likely to say that they felt safe going into work and that employers had done what they could to make their workplace safe. One sort of important aspect of the pandemic for trade unions, though, I guess, was the need to move online as we are now. So organising changed its shape quite significantly. And while that did have a lot of negative impacts for unions, sort of not being able to have face-to-face meetings with people, not being able to chat just informally at work. It did have some really positive impacts, which I'd like to hold on to. We saw that the sheer reach of being online is, I think unions have really realised this for the first time, as lots of us have, with at one point the NEU had a call with over 400,000 members on it, which is just, yeah, amazing. But also, beyond just reach, the timing and accessibility of doing these meetings online meant that a lot more women, I found, were able to engage, people without caring duty, people that do have caring duty, that typically maybe struggle to make union branch meetings, suddenly able to get involved. So I think that was a really positive step forward that should be held on to. And these less formal methods of organising, sorry, I might be on the wrong slide here now. These less formal methods of organising, like WhatsApp groups, social media, while they sort of might not be ideal for some unions, they're very effective at shaming employers into action. So something that's come from the pandemic. One really good example from Unite Hospitality, they told us a great story of how the Marriott hotel group who put all of their permanent staff on furlough, but didn't want to put their casual staff on furlough, which was about 1,500 staff. They, in each of these hotels around the country, started WhatsApp groups and were able to get them to U-turn, literally getting sort of £10,000 each with getting this furlough pay and having it backdated, and just through setting up a load of WhatsApp groups and posting on social media. And yes, finally, the report notes that this pandemic has really highlighted the value of established union power in these high density industries. It's given a kind of new legitimacy to workers, I think also in the public perception and to government. But the trend towards these new organising tactics in areas that unions have struggled to organise in before, I think was really positive. And for me, it sort of poses the question of going forward, how do we marry these two things to really recognise the real worth of those established unions in protecting people against redundancies, but also see the opportunity that has come out of these new forms of organising and engaged people that weren't engaged before. And we'd normally, I think, expect a report like this to finish with a whole set of policy recommendations. But I think one thing that really came out to me, again, on this theme of exacerbating existing problems, was that between unions and progressive organisations like Class, like the Equality Trust, and many more, we've been proposing the solutions that are required for years now. Many of them were included in the last two Labour manifestos. Even the last Conservative manifesto adopted this sort of rhetoric of levelling up, but we haven't really seen it. So the question for Class, I think, to end is not so much what policies do we need to fix our economy, but how can we build worker power to force these bigger economic changes that we have all identified. And that is me, I think. So I'm going to stop sharing there.
Wonderful. Thanks ever so much, Paddy. I'm now going to pass over to Wanda for her comments on that.
Hi, I'm going to be very democratic here, and I'm actually going to, because we are very lucky to have Ellie Mayo Hagan, who is the director, the relatively new director of class here. So I'm absolutely thrilled that she's joined us. Some of you may have caught her on any questions over the weekend. So I'm just going to invite her to give a few words about the report and what class is up to at the moment. Thank you, Ellie.
Thanks so much, Wanda, and thank you, everybody. It's great to be here, and also to see someone, Jan, who is somebody from Bangor, which is someone I know from home where I grew up. So that's a nice surprise as well. It's always nice to have someone who knows your mum on a Zoom meeting. So in terms of what class is doing, I'll just start with that, and I'll be really short because I don't want to turn this into a sort of promotional event for class. But we are basically, under my directorship, we're sort of building tools that can help people like you sort of work better. We're sort of using our unique connection to the labour movement to really understand the lives of working class people and to build the tools that people like you will need in order to be more effective at persuading people, and that includes both sort of working class people themselves and also people in government, to support policies that basically rebalance wealth and power in favour of the majority. So just something small. And this report is part of that. And we have another report that Paddy is starting now on unions in the insecure economy, where we're basically looking at the gig economy and how it's sort of taken over every facet of working life. It's not just Uber drivers and Amazon workers, it's also university lecturers, journalists and care workers. So that's another thing we'll be looking at. And in terms of this report itself, I suppose I've been thinking of this report mainly lately in terms of a third wave of coronavirus, because it looks like that is what we're heading for. And I think in the public sphere, we've seen a lot of conversation about border control and how if we had just had stricter borders, that we wouldn't be in the position that we're in now. But Australia, which has one of the world's most strictest border policies under COVID, still has the Delta variant in its country. So I think it's inevitable that the variant will eventually spread to each country. I think what isn't inevitable is that they then rip through that country when they arrive. And that's what many other countries have avoided and we haven't. And why is that? It's because, as Paddy said, we have not paid people to self-isolate. And so we're in a position now where nearly half of people in this country cannot afford to self-isolate when they get coronavirus symptoms. And that really is the perfect conditions for a virus to spread through the population. You know, and particularly when it comes to young people. So one of the statistics in this report, I think Paddy might have mentioned, is that 6 in 10 young people said that they've been forced to go to work when they didn't feel comfortable. And of course, this is the group of young people who are not yet vaccinated, or they've only had one vaccine so far. So really, far from being, as Paddy said, far from being a kind of choice between the economy and public health, actually what's happened is we have ignored public health, and then that has had a detrimental effect on the economy, because instead of actually shutting down for a small amount of time and really driving cases down low, what we've actually done is we haven't provided the economic conditions for people to really self-isolate. And so we find ourselves in this endless loop of shutting down, opening back up, shutting down, opening back up, because no measures we're taking are really good enough until we can understand that in order for people to self-isolate, they need to feel protected financially, and that is a terrible position to put people in. So I think that's the main thing that I'm thinking about at the moment in terms of this report, that this third wave that we are currently going into is directly related to everything that Paddy just laid out. That really everything that was laid out in that report are the driving forces behind the rise in cases. And this is not something that is being spoken about in any widespread way. And it is something that I think really needs to be spoken about, because, you know, a lot of scientists say that we're on the home stretch now when it comes to the pandemic. And I think that we really need to get this sorted so that once and for all we can say we can move on and live in some kind of normal. And I just don't think that's going to happen until we actually recognize that people's health and the health of the wider economy are intrinsically linked to one another. So I suppose that's my main takeaway. And just to say, I'm really grateful to you all coming along and listening to the report. I think I'm really proud of the work that Paddy's done. I think it's been a really important report, and it's certainly helped me when I sort of go on panels or go in the media to talk about this issue, to be able to make arguments. So thank you so much for coming along and listening to it.
Great, thank you. And I think, you know, that really gets to the heart of what we at the Equality Trust really believe in, that, you know, the range of inequality, whether we're talking about dignity at work, whether we're talking about income, the range of income disparities across the labour market is so truly connected to health, is so truly connected to the social determinants of health and the social determinants, the social ills that are still blighting society at a much higher rate because we have such high levels of income inequality. So it's really, you know, it's really useful to see that breakdown and to see exactly which sectors are most hardest hit, and that intersectional approach, because it feeds into a lot of the work that we've been doing recently on gender pay gaps, on, you know, ensuring that we are putting the data on the FTSE 100 out there and available for people to look at, and working with trade unions to look at collective bargaining, to be able to use that, to be able to look at the different pay gaps and look at the CEO pay and the inequality that we've been tracking for so long. I was quite amused to hear Diana Holland, Joe Grady and Steve Turner described as union reps. Which I really liked, actually. I think that brings us all back down to earth. But obviously, as someone who used to work at the ATL before it merged into the NEU, seeing that power of convening, seeing the fact that, you know, as we are this evening, gathering people from across the globe even into one meeting, and organising at a different level now because we're able to have that reach is really important. And I really hope that's transformative for trade unions in the way that they continue to do work, because, you know, I was only able to get fully involved in the union and be branch secretary when the unions were in my working place, when the meetings were in my working place. I wasn't able to go to, you know, meetings at 6 o'clock in a local pub, as many of us, you know, who have caring duties aren't. So I really do want to see a change to some of those trade union practices come out of this, and for them to recognise that they can get greater reach. When we look at the Fight for 15 campaign in the States and the organising that's been happening across some of the fast food outlets, which has been digital, it's really great to see that. And I think your point about agency is absolutely spot on, because for far too long, we've sort of looked to other places to sort of come and save us. We've you know, put our trust in a variety of different organisations and institutions. And actually what's absolutely essential is that we recognise our own agency, our agency to organise in the workplace, and our trade unions are only as good as we are as members. So that's really, really important. And I think it's really important to highlight that there is no back to normal, because as we all know, the normal we had before was terrifically broken. So, you know, trying to get back to something and talking in the language of going back to normal is really quite distracting. And it was no surprise to any of us who were engaged in inequality debates that it was the taxi drivers, the security guards, the care workers who were bearing the brunt of COVID, because we know that these are the occupations and the division of the labour market that sees so many people with fewer rights, but also with fewer autonomy, less autonomy over their work. And that's one of the reasons that, you know, thinking about the research that you've done on young people, and we can all see that happening around us, that we decided it was really essential to work with the group of young people that we work with, to talk to them about employment rights, to find out what they knew, to find out if they were taught about employment rights. You know, is this something that we can get into a school curriculum, and we can ensure that people know their employment rights, so that when they go into the workplace, when they go into the labour market, they at least know if they're being ripped off, or if they're not, you know, if they're working for an unscrupulous employer. Now, of course, having the agency and the ability to do something about that is different in terms of the gig economy and those power dynamics, but at least if people are aware, they can think about what it's possible to do. And I think the whole, what you were saying about the gig economy as well has really affected the flotation of Deliveroo, for example, that we saw, where the reputation of organisations is becoming a hygiene issue. We know from all of our work on CEO pay that this is already a hygiene issue, but that the working practices and the way that they're treating their workers is becoming a hygiene issue that shareholders have to be aware of is also really, really important. So it's really, really great, always great to have more current evidence to add to our arguments. And I think, our sector works as a kind of cathedral, in a sense that we all have a different role to play. We all support each other in trying to get that progressive change that we want, because we know that inequality is not inevitable. It is about policy changes, but I think, as you've rightly pointed out, it is also about our own agency and what change that we can make, either as individuals or collectively, and that's really, really important. So I think some of the shifts that we're seeing in terms of inequality have been really interesting, seeing how the debate is shifting, thinking about the debate on wealth tax, for example, which even 2 or 3 years ago would have been something that we wouldn't have seen happening, thinking about corporation tax, thinking about even the tone of the Sunday Times Rich List, which of course we've been tracking for years, but even seeing the tone of that change and the recognition that, we shouldn't be worshipping at the altar of the wealthy, I think signifies a real change in direction. And of course, it's up to all of us to keep that pressure up to make sure that change continues to happen.